Hello, my name is Portia Sabin. I am the president of the Music Business Association. For those of you who are not familiar with Music Biz, we are a trade association in the music space for everyone who handles the commerce of recorded music. So we have the labels, publishers, we have retail stores, we have managers, we have DSPs, and we have music tech companies. So we have a varied membership. And we're sort of the place in the industry where people come together to talk about issues, to learn new things, and to do business. So check us out online, musicbiz.org. And now, my guest for the day.
Hi.
Hi.
Am I supposed to introduce myself?
Just go right ahead. Just go for it.
Okay, sure.
Introduce yourself.
Yeah, well, nice to meet you, first of all, Portia.
Yeah, nice to meet you.
It's great to be here. I'm Raymond Rozer. I am the global head of editorial for Amazon Music. I'm here in Los Angeles, and you want a little bit of my bio. I got my start as a magazine publisher. I founded a magazine way back in the 1990s, focused on music, particularly underground music at the time, the emerging sounds around electronic and hip hop before it was pop. And after that, started moving into video. Most recently was at AEG, looking after large festival properties such as Coachella and Stagecoach, where my responsibilities revolved around live streaming, original content, which included documentaries and social content, and just sort of had a purview across all things in the content space for our festivals division at AEG. And 6 months ago, I joined Amazon Music, and I'm excited to be here. This is my first talk in my new seat in Amazon Music, and I'm thrilled.
Awesome. Well, we're throwing you on the hot seat right away. 6 months in, boom.
Right.
Let's talk.
Throw me there.
So let's go back a little bit, because your bio says you are a graffiti artist.
Yes, not still, but yes.
You were a graffiti artist.
Wow, this is
so
straight on the hot seat.
This is good.
This is good. I like this. So in high school, in Los Angeles, I discovered graffiti before I discovered hip hop. But I was enamored by doing art. I still am an artist, but I was always enthralled with color and with typography. And so I attribute a lot of my early curiosity around creating what would become editorial content through doing graffiti, because it was really, graffiti is all about messages and all about the lore and sort of the architecture of the culture and the stories of all the characters, and its connection to hip hop, of course, is well documented. And so I give a lot of credit to being a graffiti artist, surviving as a graffiti artist, and getting out into the world where I wasn't, breaking laws and stuff. But I still love the art, and I still really sort of go to it mentally in terms of like what is exciting about art.
Yeah, I think growing up in Manhattan in the 70s and 80s, graffiti, like I think kids today kind of can't fully appreciate the meaning that graffiti had in culture. In the 70s, the subway trains in New York City were still really heavily graffitied, and that was a thing. It's actually funny now. Every now and then I go back to New York and I'm like, wow, this place is like Disneyland. It's like clean and everything's nice and there's no graffiti. I'm like, what happened to this place? I used to hang out in Central Park, and you'd run around and get like the bottom of a Coke bottle in your foot, It was it's all like concrete and broken glass, and now it's just like this lovely hermetic place.
There's a great, and those New York artists still are heroes of mine. Artists like Futura, Dondi, who passed away some years back, but Lee. These are the guys whose art I emulated, and a lot of graffiti artists that sort of came up when I did, in the 80s, learning the art and learning the history. Like New York was, of course, the beacon, and then we gave it our LA flavor. It's funny too. There's a scene. There's a great movie called The Warriors, and there's a scene in it where this street gang, this New York street gang, emerges in Union Square, and it is in the movie like the scariest place to emerge. And anybody knows Union Square today, it's not so scary. New York has changed.
Yeah, and we could talk about that forever because
Yes.
the history of the different neighborhoods. I went to school at Stuyvesant when it was on the Lower East Side, and so Union Square being right at 14th Street for a lot of people really marked the boundary between downtown and uptown.
Yeah.
And so Union Square was like the borderland of super scary place, but now it's like Sony is across the street, so it's a very different world today. Anyway, so let's.
Sorry.
Oh, sorry.
We won't talk about New York but New York has it has held a place in my evolution in music. It was where I was introduced to club music, really. It was where I looked to some of the earliest hip hop that I love, like De La Soul, Eric B. and Rakim, the Jungle Brothers. Like there's so many of the prototypes that became what I love to this day. So I owe a lot to New York. Yeah.
Yeah, no doubt. So let's talk about, you co-founded Herb, and so clearly music had sort of made inroads into your life. How did it come about?
Yeah. I like a lot of kids, I grew up in a household that it was just me and my mom, but she had a record collection, and there were some albums out there that I sort of took note of, and then she gave me an allowance. I started buying my own records, and started to really consider myself, a fan of music. I love listening to music. It was part of the fuel of my childhood. It's what I hear when I think about childhood memories a lot. And but it wasn't until I got into hip hop and I got into electronic music and industrial music and alternative electronic music and whatnot that I started to sort of see music as a deeper culture, especially on the hip hop side and the electronic music side. And that's really what fueled, starting the magazine. It was a really simple thing that I still find is a tenet for how I look at editorial or look at storytelling. It was there's something going on out there. There's something going on in the underground. There's something going on in music culture. And I want to talk about it, and I want other people to know about it, and I want to know more about it. So it comes from a place of selfish curiosity, but also like a real hunger to share and tell stories and turn people on to something new. And to think that I could still do that, so many years later, and still, get paid for it and have it as my career, I feel really blessed. But it was a sense of wanting to ensure that those stories get from my enthusiasm into other people's hands that got me into wanting to do a magazine.
Yeah, totally. I think the coolest thing about music is that a song, and a song for sure, but also definitely an album, those are like a window into a story that someone's telling, and it's so exciting, right? It's like you hear something or you see an album and you're like, what is going on here? It's like it captures you and it brings you to a different place. And I think that's one of the things that's so compelling. And when we were young, we didn't have the internet. So I think one of the big differences for kids today is it's like if you get captured by a song or a visual, you just can instantly Google that artist and find out a whole bunch about them, and sort of like you say to yourself, what's that story? And then you go and find out what the story is. But I feel like it was very different when I was a kid. You had to go and spend hours pawing through record bins and trying to read stories in music magazines about your favorite artists to just try to piece together the story of what was going on.
Yeah, there was definitely, there was less music overall. But it was harder to find even the most basic information. If you didn't have liner notes, maybe you heard something on the radio, which so many, kids did, right? Where would you go? I remember distinctly when I discovered De La Soul on the radio. For weeks, I didn't know what they were, who was behind it, what the band looked like, and I had to track down information. That seems crazy, right? It seems like I was living in the Stone Age, but that was real life, for anybody in the 80s and 90s discovering music as a kid. And nowadays, of course, you have it all instantly available. That but it's also compounded by the fact that there's so much music, and artists in some ways are also sort of telling their own stories. But how do you contextualize that? And how do you dig for the connection between music and artists and genres? And how do you sort through, 1,000 songs being released every day, and, where you might, be most interested in? So I think there's still an interesting role for editorial, social media, one-on-one communication around what, fans, all of that, to build contextual stories around music. So as much as it's easy today, it's also really congested and sort of crowded. So I think curation is still a really important aspect of it, whether it's, a service that's curating, or whether it's an individual that sends you their playlist that they're excited about, or a DJ that you hear. That's all curation to sort of steer you into discovery.
I'm really glad you used the word curation, because I ran an independent record label for 13 years. And, I sort of ran it from 2006 to 2019. So I was doing it right when everybody was like, artists don't need a record label anymore. Why would artists need a record label? And it's been interesting to watch sort of this like bell curve, or the sine wave of what happened when the internet when Spotify especially came to America and really became a big thing. Because I think one of the main functions of a record label historically has been to be a curator, right? We find the stuff, or like, I ran a record label called Kill Rock Stars. So we had Bikini Kill, Slater Kinney, Huggy Bear, Bratmobile. So it's like, if you liked early 90s Riot Girl music, then you became a person who was like, oh, I want to see what's out on Kill Rock Stars, because I know that they like what I like,
Yeah. They have an identity. Label has an identity. The label has a personality. Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
Exactly. And I'm sure you had the same thing when you were a kid, because when I was growing up, I remember I was always interested in what like SST was putting out, or there's a million labels from my childhood or like 4AD. Like I loved 4AD bands in the late 80s. That was like very that to me had a curatorial purpose, and I would buy something on it even without having heard the band. And then when the internet came on and everybody was like, this is great, and everybody started putting their music up, it's like the promise of the internet was the ease of and creating a place for more voices to be heard, which totally is true and good and did happen. But it also created this ocean of music, which suddenly made it so much harder to find the stuff that you might be interested in. So curatorial functions then arose. Like playlists are basically curation tools, right? And all of these other things that have sprung up. It's like we had curation, and then we're like, we don't need curation anymore. And now we're like, oh, thank God there's curation.
Well, I think in part what changed, and I actually support this. I think it's actually a net positive, even though it was very disruptive. But I think curation from on high is less. It's not less a thing. It's just not the only thing. And so I do believe in expert curation and seasoned curators, right? And which includes DJs and people who create playlists and DSPs and everybody else that sort of puts out a directional menu of music for fans. That said, there's fans that can just go peer to peer, and there's independent curators that no one's ever heard of that become celebrated and sort of build their own voice. And so we've graduated from a time when it was just magazines and labels and a handful of others that sort of determine, and radio programmers that sort of determine what your listening would consist of, and the circle around the pool of music that you might get exposed to unless you were really industrious and curious. And I think that's, I'm happy that that's sort of changed, even though that means that there was less of a rationale to have a magazine tell you what was cool. But I think that went along with all those things you also mentioned, which was an ability and a flattening and a democratization of the music and the production of it all. Whereas if you were trying to get a record out and you were an independent artist doing something strange like hip hop in 1982, good luck, right? Like you had, I mean, it's amazing. I have records that go back 40 years that I've, collected from the time I was a kid to now. And some of those, like from 1982 and 83, are on these labels that never heard from again. Tiny little, independent labels that were the only thing to put out a hip hop album at the time, or hip hop single at the time. And, thank goodness that they were there, because what existed above them, the framework and the major labels at the time, and we're not interested in hearing about it. So SST on the punk side was another one of those labels that sort of created an avenue. So I think that is now gone fully in the way of, you can release records and music on your own. You can do that and then get signed to a major label. You can not get signed to a major label, but I think like the pathway to get in front of fans is very democratized, and that is absolutely a good thing in my opinion.
Yeah, no, I completely agree, but I just think it's interesting. Oh, now there's an echo. That's weird. Do you hear an echo?
I don't on my end. I'm
okay.
Sound fine.
Weird. I think that is great. I think it's totally good to have that democratization, but I also think that there's a role that some curation plays in just helping cut through the massive amount. I mean, Spotify just came out earlier this week saying that people are uploading 60,000 songs. What was it? A day? Was it really a day? Oh my God.
I mean, there's a lot of music coming in. If there's no curation, and it's just being left up to sort of the word of mouth and sort of willy-nilly. I think the quality and the appreciation for what is really out there might get squelched a bit. So like you, playlists. I mean, Amazon Music playlists is a point of discovery for me and for millions of our customers. And I think that as much as we love to see the flattening of how music can surface, and we want everybody to be able to find sort of everything. I think people really do want to be they want to be able to cut through the clutter, and they want to trust certain curation. They want to learn that a playlist is really speaking to them. And here's another thing, like you don't kind of know what you don't know. So a lot of people can be sort of like, oh, I'm on top of music, or I'm getting I like this certain vibe, or I like this certain label, and then someone exposes them to something that how would they even have known to look for, or contextualizes it in a way. I think of some of the playlists that are out there that are just sort of like, wow, I never really thought of building sort of that framework around music, or I wouldn't have known where to start to find this level of artistry in this sector or this sound. So I do think, I think curation is going to be an important part of how we sift through the clutter, and whether that's personalization, that's sort of done algorithmically, which I think is super powerful, or it's sort of hand done curation by music experts. I think they both serve a purpose.
I think one of the most interesting things about this era is that I think for a long time in the music industry, people thought that consumers, that fans were fairly hidebound, right? Like if you were hidebound, like, if you were a Backstreet Boys fan, then you were going to like, some other boy band, I think people thought that most fans sort of fit into boxes, or at least whether people thought that or not, I think that's sort of how people were marketed to.
Yeah.
And one of the coolest things about the internet for me is that people are discovering that they love stuff that they never, you can be a K-pop fan and a fan of Bratmobile. You know what I mean? Like they're not. It has democratized music in a way by sort of getting rid of the genre constraints, right? So people are allowed to be fans of more music. I mean, I don't know how it was when you were a kid, but I was.
It was tribal. It was very tribal.
I was very tribal. Are you kidding? I wouldn't even talk to people who listened to Top 40. Like I wasn't. I forget it.
Yeah. I mean, that mindset is still still around for certain people and certain genres. There's definitely some dividing lines that people seem to have built, but they've largely been dissipated by one, the personalized way you can listen to music now, sort of, with a playlist that a library that is, hundreds or tens of millions of songs. And that is your window into wherever you want to go. It's your doorway to wherever you want to go musically. Whereas in the past, you sort of had to like make a commitment and buy an album and go to that record store, or even learn where that music was sold. And that's all came crashing down, 20 some odd years ago with, sort of the arrival of digital music. And I think that continues to sort of be where the industry and the music community continues to flourish, like, because there's so many flirtations across what used to be these borders between pop and underground and hip hop and R&B and hip hop and rock and country and hip hop. It's like the best stuff coming out in many ways is these blends. There's a million terms for what that would be, and we're not going to use the term mashup, but like it really is this sort of permission to be curious around a lot of different genres. And I think that's the beauty of digital music service, right? Because it's this always on doorway into wherever you want to go, curiosity wise, without any barriers, without any like permissions, without any like change of wardrobe. You just go there. I want to lounge and listen to classical. Great. I suddenly now want to be into like hardcore drum and bass. Great. Like, knock yourself out. Like, no one's watching. You're all good. A lot of kids that grew up, went to high school. When I went to high school, we were not given those same permissions, or you were the oddball, which I was sort of the oddball because I liked hip hop and heavy metal. So there you go.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Yeah.
It was, I love the word tribal because it absolutely was tribal. And it's very freeing to think that kids don't have to be that way anymore.
No. Oh, man, it's so freeing these days.
Love.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So much expression. I mean, I've got young girls, and, watching them sort of discover music in ways that have just zero pretense around where they should end up. Obviously, that may change as they move into like high school, and there'll be some expectations or whatnot, but I think they're learning the way that music, I think, is its most beautiful, that it is really, it's personal, and it's also communal. It's wherever you want to interact with it. And it's not for anybody else to sort of dictate and decide what and how you should be listening to. I credit a lot of artists recently too for, doing stuff that sort of blurs those lines. Post Malone, artists that are huge, that are, bringing in like this blend of everything and flirting with rock and bringing into the worlds of hip hop, or obviously Lil Nas X with country. There's a lot of, I've seen it over the last 10 years. We're talking about, what's happened over the last 20 or 30 years, but really over the last 10 years, what's changed in terms of how artists are feeling liberated to sort of just be themselves wherever they want to be creatively, I think is a generational shift. I mean, there's no doubt that this is part of a new generation of creators that aren't coming in with the same sort of chip or expectations of how they need to behave in music, which I think is amazing.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I wonder about how that plays out in culture as a whole. I don't know. We're probably neither one of us qualified to have that conversation, but we could do it for fun. Just in terms
of, you can always take a stab at it. I mean, I think
in terms of like the fluidity, you know what I mean? The broad nature.
Yeah, listen, there's no doubt. I mean, the music reflects culture and culture reflects music. It is, I'd argue, one of the single most important fabrics that, sort of connect humanity is what we listen to is music, and how we how we engage with sounds and creators that make the music that we love, more than most things. And so there's no doubt that it starts to inform. And you could just look at history of how, how punk influenced fashion and attitude, and hip hop influenced fashion and attitude, but it also influenced culture, and it also influenced how, race, and how we talked about race, and how we connected around race, and just name a genre, and there's something that it's. I mean, dance music, with areas of gender and identity, and also race and technology. These are all things that were both driven by and drove, those music. So that will continue to be the case. It's hard sometimes to see it, when you're sort of right in the middle of it. So, people can be a little more dismissive of the music of the day. They're like, well, it's not, maybe doing as much, or it's not driving culture as much. But that's let's get off my lawn sort of mentality. It all still is changing things. I watched something the other day that sort of shed some light on an artist. Won't talk about the project specifically, but it was really illuminating, and I hadn't quite seen the artist as much as I appreciated the artist. I didn't quite see it generationally through that lens, and really understanding now what the impact of that artist's career is, over the last 10 years, and how that one artist sort of changed the trajectory of music in some ways. And that's going to happen in the future, just as it's happening today. But sometimes it takes you a little bit of distance, or, to what I said earlier, a contextualization, a storyteller that comes along and puts it, sort of aligns the pieces where you're like, oh yeah, oh, I get it. Because I mean, we take it for granted, if we're in this industry a bit, that, we sort of see how the sausage is made, as they say. And that sometimes can make you think that that's the rest of the world, but the rest of the world doesn't always see that. And they sort of see it through a thinner lens sometimes. And sometimes it takes a contextualization, a playlist, a curation, a DJ set, or a doc, or some other sort of storytelling device to sort of give you perspective that you might not have had, and realize the power of what that music's actually doing around you.
Yeah, and I bought my first album with my own money in 1981, and when now,
that's a great year. It's a great year to buy. It's a great year to buy.
And now, as a much older person, I look back and I think, if you were a rock fan in 1981, there had been 17 years since the Beatles.
Yeah.
So there was that much of rock music, and then of course before that you can dig into other, other types of music and other iterations of what became rock, But now, for a kid born now, there is so much music. It's categorically a different experience, right? Because I remember, when I became a crazy music fan, that I could trace the connection between this person and this band and this band, and it was all taking place within a relatively short time period. So you could still do that. Now, the music, it's like, how do you do that in the ocean? You know what I mean? How do you make the connections in this vast sea?
I mean, music, like anything, it's like music is content, and content over the last, 15, 20 years has exploded by way of digital distribution. And so the minute that we pixelated and turned music into zeros and ones, we changed the game, and that meant that there was going to be an exponential amount more of it. And the production ability, there's so many great productions now that are just done in bedrooms on the floor with, a couple of pieces of equipment, or maybe just a laptop. And these become big records, like million selling records. That's changed it all. So I think, like, to what we were talking about earlier, the sheer magnitude of the amount of music that's out there is really exciting. And I think that the fans today too have a whole different set of ways that they navigate that, again, it's generational, but it's interesting to see that the toolkit for navigating the music has also obviously advanced. And while it may not be the traditional vehicles of magazines and radio in the same way that it was, there are a host of new ways of discovery that are as powerful in many ways. And we've always championed this as a magazine publisher, creating space for voices that, don't traditionally have the same space. So I really love to venture onto YouTube and just watch, reaction videos of like a young hip hop fan listening to like a folk rock, a soundtrack for the first time or something, or discovering, or vice versa, and just that way of peer-to-peer discovery, I think is so fresh, because those are not voices that, when I was, starting my magazine, there were many of, like, it was all coming from like, New York, high rises in New York that we were talking about earlier, and high rises are in LA, or media, conglomerates in LA. And there was very little happening in between. And now there's a million points of light and distribution of content and storytelling in between. Twitch, an Amazon Music service is or an Amazon service is an area where, like, exactly what we're talking about is taking flight. Like, there are so many creators on Twitch that are, streaming 10 hours of content a week, and are making music live and debuting music and talking directly to their fans and engaging, back and forth, and building community. And that's amazing, right? Like, so yeah, I'm really bullish on music of the moment and music of today. I love all the stuff from '81 and as well, and since and before, but I think there's no more exciting moment in music than right now. And even though that's not always appreciated by folks that may have seen other parts of music evolving in the heyday of the 70s, 80s, whenever, I think we'll look back and we'll also go, wow, this was quite a moment too. So
yeah, I agree. I think what else is very exciting about this moment is the new technologies that have popped up that are, and also the way they've been conceptualized. There's little tech companies that are popping up that are doing incredible things, that are allowing creators to create content using some of the works of older artists. I mean, obviously,
yeah.
The Fleetwood Mac TikTok thing is very heartwarming, and like probably the biggest example. But I mean, I'm thinking about, there's a company that allows people to make beats using, like the old hip hop technology of actually, sampling, right? But it's
Talking
all
about
legal, totally track live, right?
Yeah,
and it, and that's so exciting, because it can give older artists entirely new life and bring older music to these kids who hadn't heard of it before, while making something new. Like, it's it's very exciting.
Yeah, and that's another thing where, you have I think there's sometimes a misnomer about the level of curiosity and that, this generation, Gen Z, millennials have for discovery, and attention spans are short, and no one wants to watch anything over 2 minutes. And I think, one, that's not true. And I think a lot of times that narrative is driven by, the traditional media. I think there's a hunger and appetite for backstory. There's a hunger and appetite for contextualization. And I think a service like that, with its access to these classic samples, I think is really interesting. And while it may be a bit niche in terms of like the use case, in terms of producers, how many producers are going for that music, the fact that exists shows this sort of full arc of music of today that continues to access the music of yesterday, and telling that story, I think, is so important. There was that service, I actually posted about it on LinkedIn, but that service did a video where they showed Daft Punk's One More Time, how was made up of this one track, and the way that they cut apart and sampled the track was, of course, so genius. But I had never seen it broken out like that. I had never seen it so simply defined about how they actually took the music, found these bars, and then kind of looped these bits and then turned it into, arguably one of the biggest dance records to come out in the last 20 years. And I think it was just fascinating. It was just fascinating. It's hard to say, like, if you're a fan of that sound or that music, to not be also fascinated by the creative process that got you to that. And it's a direct byproduct of technology and what's come over the last couple of decades in terms of the ability to produce in that manner.
Totally. So what are you excited about in terms of your role at doing editorial, coming up?
Well, I mean, I'm excited about a lot of things. I find Amazon Music to be such an inventive and curious place, and so full of innovative opportunities that I get to work on. The live area is really exciting. We introduced live streaming in partnership with Twitch last year, so that we're able to sort of turn on an audience for what's happening on Twitch in terms of live music and other creator channels. So this is an Amazon Music Twitch channel. In fact, we have many of them across the globe, and that's an exciting space. We're going to be producing more content on Twitch, and also just looking at how we can deepen storytelling. We have a series of documentaries that we've produced over the last couple of years, both on artists as from back in the day, like Biggie, and we did a piece on Alanis Morissette at the anniversary of her album. But we're also looking at new artists like Gabby Barrett and Kiana Lede, and looking for ways to sort of bring breakthrough artists to the surface and sort of tell these origin stories that are so important. And a lot of the things that we were talking about earlier about giving some contextualization. We want to be contributing, and we want to be additive in terms of bringing content to the surface that is worthwhile and isn't just additional noise, but helping artists tell their own stories. So I just feel like I'm in a very lucky position to be able to work with such a great team and have the reach that Amazon Music has, and have access to artists that are open and interested in partnering with us to create this type of content.
That's cool. All right, now I just want to ask you one controversial question. Okay, I saved it for
We're
last.
almost to the end.
I know.
I'm gonna have to cut it right here.
We could just.
Okay.
We might have to. We'll see what you think.
All good.
This could be part of my, like, get off my lawn, attitude.
That's fair.
As an old person. But I have, I used to have a podcast about the music business for multiple years. And one of the issues that came up a lot was the issue of music journalism, right? And the changes that have occurred in music journalism over the last 20 years. Because first of all, there used to be a lot more magazines. There used to be a lot more jobs. That sort of went down significantly with the internet. But then also just sort of the attitude towards it. I feel like when I was younger, rock criticism was like, you were going to get a true take, right? Someone was going to say, I love this record for these reasons. Or they were going to say, I don't like this record for these reasons. And I feel like these days, what rock criticism is left, or what music journalism is left, is almost more like PR. It's almost more like the journalists feel like their job is to help promote the band, which is great. I mean, or the artist. But at the same time, some days I miss that, like, John Perella is like pissed off, I'm going to tell you what I really think of this band.
Well, there's one of my favorite movies is Almost Famous, which I'm sure probably ranks up there high for you too.
Yeah.
I was like, I dragged my wife to watch it on streaming. I'm not sure if she fully appreciated how great a movie it is, but that whole movie is sort of about what you're talking about in some ways, right? The sort of the death of rock criticism. You have to watch the movie, but it's obviously it's based in truth. There's a lot of real life characters in the film. So in a nutshell, because this could be its own conversation, clearly, I mean, I had a magazine. We were part of the machinery of getting these kinds of stories out and being critics, and so I would agree with you that it's changed quite a bit. I do think yes, a lot of the stuff you read can sound a little bit like just trying to tell you just the nice, pretty versions of everything. I think that's complicated, and for why that's happening. One, people can tune in, tune out as they want, so they're looking for places where they can align their fandom. So they're looking for places that are also fans. There's a lot of that. Rock, for lack of a better term, music critics, whatever, are not the gatekeepers that they once were. So they sort of have to play a little more along. I mean, it's not just music, right? It's movie criticism. It's a lot of things.
True.
So that democratization that we spoke of earlier has affected that as well. On the flip side, I will say that there are a ton of resources out there, or conversations that are around looking at music in a critical way, both good and bad, but they're not as centralized. So, case in point, you may go on to Substack and read and follow a journalist that's talking really interestingly about music. Then you may flip over to, the New York Times or Vox and get another sort of analysis of music in really interesting ways. It's not the traditional outlets as much as it was in the past. There isn't like a family of music magazines that sort of like run the show, like they did. So it's coming from different sources, and it's also coming from just, fans. I mean, just, go onto Instagram, go onto Facebook, see where the conversations are around music, and you'll get a lot of really thoughtful stuff and dialogue. Go onto Reddit. I mean, geez, like go onto Reddit. You'll never get off of Reddit, but like go onto Reddit and go down the rabbit hole of discussion around music, and it's massive. And so I think it's out there, but it doesn't have a central home, or as many central homes. So I think it's same with music. It's a lot more work to curate that content, and also, of course, on the professional side of it, it's sort of obviously limited the more traditional paid opportunities for journalism. That's a whole other conversation about how to, sort of make it in quote unquote journalism and music right now. I think it's a really interesting time, but that's why I'm really thankful, for Amazon Music creating this role that has editorial in the title, like it's part of what we do. And we're looking to sort of keep the bar high on how we create content that is meaningful and has a message and has a point of view, more than anything. And I think that holds up to the promise of, what really good editorial writing has done in the past. And then there's a two-way communication too. There's a place for people to not agree or think, that another artist is better version of whatever we said. And that's great too. But yeah, we're at a shift. It's not the great journalism and great writing around music and great editorial or video around music is not at all dead. But the construct that there was 10 years ago is gone, and there's a new construct shaping, and it'll probably be over the next 10 years that we'll see exactly what that ends up being.
Thoughtful answer. Thank you. I appreciate that. And I think we've gotten to the end of our time. So Raymond, thank you so much for talking to me today.
Thank you. It was a real pleasure. It was great to meet you, and thanks for having me.